Welcome everyone to our webinar today titled Recycled Crushed Glass, brought to you by Ecologiq and ARRB. My name's Isabella and I'm moderating the session today. Next slide, please. We plan to go for 60 minutes with time for questions at the end, and we'd love to have your input throughout the presentation. So you see here on the slide how to send your questions through. Now we are following government guidelines and all coming from our home offices, so fingers crossed all of our technology works. However, we also have Neva and Susie from ARRB joining in for tech support. Next slide, please. Our presenters today are Tony Alosio, Director, Ecologiq, and Dr. James Grenfell, Principal Professional, Sustainability and Resilience, ARRB. Next slide, please. All right, let's get started, and we'll now be hearing from Tony.
Thanks a lot, and welcome everyone. I'm going to give you a quick overview of Ecologiq and the Recycled First policy, and then I'll hand over to James to take you through the really interesting stuff on uses and issues with crushed glass. So next slide, please. So a little bit about Ecologiq. Now, some of you may have attended last week's reclaimed asphalt pavement webinar, so these two slides will go over that again. I know that there are other people on the line who didn't attend, so I'd like to give you a little bit of a view of who Ecologiq is and what we're trying to do, why it's important. So Ecologiq, part of the Victorian government, and our aim is to optimise the use of recycled and reused materials, being driven by Victoria's big build. It's pretty clear that there's an important juncture at this stage of future landfill crisis, along with great opportunity that comes with that. So we know that we're facing this landfill crisis potentially because China won't be taking our waste offshore as it has been. We expect, therefore, our waste stockpiles left unattended will grow exponentially in the coming years. We're also probably been pretty aware in media of the mismanagement of stockpiles and some of the issues with landfill. So we've got this potential huge stockpile of waste product growing through this coming looming landfill crisis. At the same time, Victoria's big build, which is a $70 billion plus build of road and rail throughout all of Victoria, and probably growing as stimulus continues to come through the economy, it has a voracious appetite for materials. So this concept of turning a problem into an opportunity exists right now, where we can take our waste products and use them as successful materials in our road and rail network build that's happening at the moment. To do that, we've got to innovate, we've got to grow the domestic recycling capabilities, build our local markets, and build uses and build new uses for recycled materials. In today's case, it's a well-known material. It's just been ignored or neglected to a great extent, or used in probably an ad hoc, opportunistic manner. And I think that the aim for Ecologiq is to take these sorts of recycling opportunities and create a uniform approach, or for me, an intentional and deliberate approach, as opposed to an opportunistic or ad hoc use of these materials. So this intentionality is a really important part of Ecologiq's future. Thanks, James. So one way of being intentional is by the application and implementation of the Recycled First policy. Again, government policy that requires bidders on future major transport projects to demonstrate how they're going to optimise use of recycled and reused Victorian materials. So this puts a very direct and clear pathway for the use of recycled materials on a project by project, program by program basis. It really is an opportunity and an invaluable opportunity right now to support the Recycling Victoria strategy, to create a true circular economy, and I think leave a legacy where that circular economy outcome is the new norm, is just the business as usual way of delivering transport infrastructure in Victoria. Ecologiq is supporting that implementation, and we look, and these sets of webinars are really a part of that cycle, if you like. So with that, I'll hand over to James to actually have a chat about recycled crushed glass. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Tony. Right, so my name's James Grenfell, and I'm Principal Professional at ARRB within the Sustainability and Resilience team. And as the next part of this webinar, I'm going to be going through some of the properties and applications of recycled crushed glass. And then afterwards, I'll be handing back again to Tony to go through a couple of case studies. So the issue that we're trying to deal with here is see the quite large amount of glass that Australia generates each year through glass packaging. So typically Australia uses somewhere in the region of 1.2 to 1.4 million tonnes of glass packaging a year. A large proportion of this either goes to landfill or into storage. Reprocessing currently is less commercially viable. If we were to consider just Victoria, so Victoria is currently generating around 250,000 tonnes of waste glass annually, of which 76% is recovered, and half of that becomes glass cullet. So where does all this glass come from? A lot of the glass comes from our curbside waste collection, so in our recycling bins. If we were to consider the whole of Australia, around 56% of it is recycled. So we're actually doing a bit better than average in Victoria. So there's a number of options for us to be able to use our crushed glass in infrastructure applications. So this is where our glass that's been diverted from landfill is then purchased by a recycled material supplier. This allows them to process it. The processing typically includes crushing, separation from some of the impurities. In some cases, it could be washed. It's then stockpiled to a variety of different grades. And in the next few slides, I'm going to give a little bit more information about what grades are suitable for which particular application. Also, we need to be mindful of higher value applications. So there's the option also to recover and clean our glass and then melt it and repurpose it for common domestic product uses such as bottles and jars. And so we would consider that to be a higher end use for our waste glass than to crush it for road infrastructure applications, but a certain amount of the glass isn't suitable for that type of process, and therefore we have to look to other opportunities such as road infrastructure for its reuse. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about road structures and where we could potentially use our recycled crushed glass. So the schematic at the bottom of the slide shows a typical pavement cross-section. So what we're trying to do in our road pavement is protect the subgrade from the traffic loading. And in order to do that, we build up a structure with various layers. So typically increasing in modulus as we go up through the layers. So typically on top of our subgrade, we would have an unbound granular subbase material, potentially an unbound road base, a higher quality crushed rock. And then at the top, we would have our bound or sealed layers, which could be a sprayed seal to protect the unbound granular road base, or we could be considering asphalt layers or even concrete layers. And that gives us a number of opportunities to use recycled crushed glass. So typically we would be using recycled crushed glass as a fine aggregate replacement. Typically our recycled crushed glass is a passing 5mm product, so or passing 4.75mm product, so a graded product that would be fairly similar to the natural sand portion in our road infrastructure. So there's options to use it in asphalt layers. So typically in an asphalt base course, we could be considering up to 15% by mass of asphalt, or a more conservative approach around 5% in an asphalt wearing course. And I'll come on in a bit more detail as to why that's the case a bit later. There's also the option to use recycled crushed glass as a partial fine aggregate replacement in concrete. And also certain levels of recycled crushed glass can be used in both granular sub-base and also granular road base. Also, as part of road infrastructure, there's a number of other applications where recycled crushed glass can also help us. So we could also be looking at using recycled crushed glass as a bedding sand replacement. There's the option to use it in drainage applications. Also, it could be used in embankment fill and in landscaping. So there's a number of different areas across the road reserve where we could consider using recycled crushed glass. So now I'm just going to move on to asphalt. And again, there's options to substitute for various sizes of fine and coarse aggregate within hot mix asphalt. As I alluded to before, typically we would be considering a sub 4.75mm size product, and this product is crushed to give it a continuous grading, and therefore is used as the fine aggregate replacement. We need to bear in mind its shape. It's important to be crushing it to gain a fairly homogeneous shape for our crushed glass, which is again one of the reasons why we're typically crushing to 4.75mm or below. So if you were to consider, say, a glass, the wall of a glass jar, typically that might be in the region of 5mm thickness. Therefore, if we crush our product to below that size, that we get fairly homogeneous size dimensions in all directions, and that's particularly important. We don't want to have flaky particle shapes, because those can then be detrimental to the resultant properties of the asphalt mixture. So the use of recycled crushed glass in asphalt pavements isn't new. It's been carried out since the 1970s. There's been a lot of research undertaken, particularly around understanding the resultant performance of asphalt mixtures containing recycled crushed glass. So one of the concerns is rutting resistance. And again, research has shown that rut resistance tends to decrease with increasing recycled crushed glass content, but can be kept within acceptable limits. So it's been shown that up to 15% recycled crushed glass content, that we don't have any concerns with rutting resistance, but as we increase significantly above that, there's the potential for a reduction in the rutting resistance, and most of that is related to the surface texture of our recycled crushed glass, which is it tends to be a bit smoother than the natural aggregates that it would be replacing. There's also been research looking at fatigue performance of asphalt containing recycled crushed glass, and most of the research has shown it to have either similar performance or potentially even slightly improved fatigue performance compared to traditional natural aggregates. Another concern for asphalt is the potential for stripping or moisture damage. Some of those concerns are related to the cleanliness of the glass, and the cleaner the glass, the better the adhesion of the glass to the bitumen, which prevents moisture damage. I guess another one of those concerns is that the adhesion is also related to the specific surface area of the aggregate in question, and therefore due to the slightly smoother surface texture of recycled crushed glass aggregates, there's the potential for a reduction in the stripping resistance in comparison to natural aggregates. But typically in asphalt, we could be allowing a 50% replacement of the fine aggregates with glass fines, and that's typically for asphalt bases. We might have a few more concerns if we were to consider a wearing course, where we could be concerned that glass particles could pluck out of the surface, and therefore to overcome that we would consider a lower upper limit on the glass content, which could be around 5%. Again, there's the potential that we might consider a finer graded recycled crushed glass product in a wearing course, but obviously again we'd have to offset against the increased processing costs to reduce its size fraction in that way. The next topic I'm going to talk about a bit is concrete. So again, glass cullet can be used as a replacement for the fine aggregate in concrete applications. In both asphalt and concrete, recycled crushed glass can be particularly useful to mitigate against the lack of natural sand. So in certain areas in Australia, there's a lack of the sand size portion of aggregates, and therefore by incorporating recycled crushed glass we can counteract that lack of natural product and also reduce the amount of virgin aggregate that needs to be mined, and we can also reduce the amount of distance that materials need to be hauled if we've got local recycled crushed glass stockpiles. One of the advantages to using recycled crushed glass in concrete has been the observed reduction in drying shrinkage. So the incorporation of recycled crushed glass has been shown to reduce the drying shrinkage, which is particularly advantageous for the use of concrete. We do need to be mindful of contamination in recycled crushed glass if we're incorporating it into concrete, particularly around the presence of sugars, which obviously are quite prevalent in the container glass that's used for both food products and also drinks bottles. So the presence of sugar is quite detrimental to the cement hydration process. And obviously the cement hydration process is what gives concrete its strength. So it's important to use clean glass when we're incorporating it into concrete, so that we don't detrimentally affect that cement hydration process. Another note about recycled crushed glass is that if it's processed to a fine enough powder, it actually has some pozzolanic properties, which means that it can react with lime to stabilize materials. It would then produce a lower compressive strength material than using cement alone, which potentially has some advantages in some applications, and it can also be more economical to use than cement. So if we were to consider the amount of recycled crushed glass that we could put into general concrete paving, at the moment in Victoria we're allowed to use or replace up to 30% of the fine aggregate with glass fines. So now if we just move on to granular materials. So again, as I mentioned, there's the option to use recycled crushed glass in both base course and sub-base layers on sealed roads. So in terms of granular sub-base and granular base course, we don't have to be so concerned about the cleanliness. There are some considerations that we wouldn't really want to be using dirty glass in unsealed roads, because that can potentially lead to some leachate issues. But if we're considering sprayed sealed roads, there's certain acceptable limits on the amount of recycled crushed glass that can be used in different classes of crushed rock as supplementary materials. And obviously those allowable limits reduce as we move up through the classes from the lower quality class 4 material, which we could allow up to 50% supplementary materials or fine glass fines, through to a class 1 crushed rock where we couldn't accept any more than 5%. But typically the recycled crushed glass has very similar physical and mechanical properties to the natural sand component that it's replacing, and in some cases can be more economical than the natural sand, particularly in areas where there's a lack of natural sand and therefore it needs to be imported in. So we've actually been undertaking quite a bit of work at ARRB recently, looking at the performance of various granular blends for both sub-base and base courses, and assessing those under our extra large wheel tracking facility, and comparing them with typically used natural aggregate and recycled crushed concrete, and even including potentially 20% recycled crushed glass, even in cooperation with 20% recycled crushed brick. We're still seeing that these materials are performing adequately for certain locations within our pavement structure. Other applications where we could be using recycled crushed glass include fill and bedding materials. So we could be using them for bedding and backfilling around underground pipes, cables and conduits, etc. There's also the option to use recycled crushed glass as a bedding material for block paved pavements and footpaths, and there's also some options to use it as top dressing and turf underlay. So again, there's some guidance and rules around bedding materials and backfill materials. So typically our bedding materials would have 100% material passing 19mm sieve size, and still be a graded product with 5 to 40% allowable passing the 0.75mm sieve size, so the 75 micron sieve. And again, there's some fairly similar rules around backfill materials. This material is allowed to be a bit coarser than bedding materials, but again, it's fairly similar rules. So we just need to be mindful of what's allowed in terms of glass fine limits, but there's some rules within Vic roads, and at the moment ARRB's actually undertaking some work for Austroads to try to help produce guidelines and specifications around the use of recycled crushed glass as a bedding material. Other applications that I mentioned before include embankment fill, also as drainage layers and in landscaping. So embankment fill, you would think, represents a very large opportunity to use recycled crushed glass due to the sheer volumes of material that are used in those applications. We've seen recently that there's been a number of local government entities that have been introducing recycled crushed glass as drainage layers within their pavement structures. So typically they've been screening their recycled crushed glass product. So taking a product that would be within 2 to 4.75 millimeters, which is seen to be free draining, and allows us to produce drainage layers which could be used potentially above the subgrade in the pavement structure. Again, we need to be mindful of the source of our glass product. So we don't want to include any glass from ceramics or cathode ray tubes or fluorescent light fillings or even laboratory glassware. So that's again down to potential contaminants and the issues around leachates. Another interesting use of recycled crushed glass that's been highlighted recently is that there's the potential to produce a foamed recycled crushed glass product, which has some potential as a lightweight fill material for certain embankment applications. So now I'm just going to cover some barriers and opportunities to the use of recycled crushed glass. So again, some of this will be reiterating some of the points that I made in some of the previous slides. But in terms of barriers and risks, we have to be very mindful of dirty or contaminated glass. So if we were to consider introducing recycled crushed glass into an asphalt plant, we just need to be mindful that its potential to give off emissions or odors due to the high temperatures involved. So we just need to be mindful of managing that. We also need to be mindful of stockpile management. So again, we're always hearing about the large amounts of recycled crushed glass that's stockpiled around the state. And if we're going to have stockpiles of crushed product around, we just need to be mindful that we manage those stockpiles to prevent both contamination and leachates getting into underlying ground and soil. So potentially lining our stockpiles to prevent them from leaching directly into the soil. As mentioned before, we need to be very mindful of the presence of sugar, especially if we're going to be using it in concrete applications. So we need to have cleaning processes in place. Otherwise, that dirt and contamination and the sugars can be detrimental to the cement hydration process. If we're introducing our recycled crushed glass into asphalt mixtures, we just need to be mindful about balances in terms of not including too much recycled crushed glass that we could risk permanent deformation and rutting issues. But typically we don't see any reduction in properties up to 15% recycled crushed glass content by mass of asphalt mixture. There's also the potential that we could be affecting the moisture sensitivity, and that's again down to potential contaminants, but also potentially down to the slightly smoother surface of recycled crushed glass in comparison to natural aggregates. So we just need to be mindful there, and obviously that's again going to be dependent on what combination of aggregate type that's also being incorporated into the asphalt mixture, and also potentially on the bitumen source. And again, there's a note that there is the potential to have some stripping of glass cullet from wearing courses and risk of exposure to the surface. So again, there's ways in which we can counteract that, which I'll come on to probably in the next slide. So in terms of opportunities for incorporating more recycled crushed glass into our road infrastructure, there are a lot of improved specifications for each application that are being developed at the moment, which will allow us to have more understanding of both the levels of recycled crushed glass that we could be incorporating, but also the processing that would be most applicable for that end application. So in terms of particle sizes, whether or not it's required to be cleaned, so those types of things. So specifications are at the moment being further developed to give more advice and guidance. It's likely that these guidelines and specifications will be very end application specific. So again, as I mentioned before, if we were to be including glass as a drainage layer, that typically we might be screening the product that's 2 mil to 4.75 mil, that would be very useful for drainage products. Again, potentially that's then giving an opportunity to have a finer size product, a 2 mil minus product that could potentially be more useful in wearing courses to prevent the potential for the larger glass sizes plucking out of wearing course surfaces. Again, we're seeing a lot of improvement in the processing of our recycled crushed glass products now. So there's improved cleaning technologies that are becoming available, which will allow us to open recycled crushed glass up to more different end applications. Processing plants are generally quite easy to set up, and therefore we can be using very local sources of material. So there's some quite small scale processing plants that are available, and there's also the availability of mobile crushing plants, which allows us to treat stockpiles of waste glass very locally, and then use that glass directly into the infrastructure nearby. So again, reducing the need for transportation. In terms of moisture susceptibility, there's a number of additives that could be used to reduce those potential moisture susceptibility issues. So anti-stripping agents, etc. So there's ways to manage some of the potential issues that are seen around recycled crushed glass to make them perform very well in asphalt mixtures, for example. As I mentioned before, in terms of the use of recycled crushed glass in granular materials, that there's been the development of tests to benchmark granular materials performance, which are easy to implement and very quick to be able to confirm different recycled materials blend suitability for certain applications. So these types of tests will again be able to increase our confidence in the use of recycled crushed glass in granular materials. And again, there are potential economies to be made by having on-site glass processing facilities at asphalt and concrete plants. So again, that gives us the advantage to be able to process materials on site and incorporate it straight into asphalt or concrete for infrastructure applications. Right, I'm now going to hand back to Tony, who's going to cover a couple of case studies. So away you go, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, James. Okay, let's first talk about the Western Freeway alignment project as our first case study, one of two. Thanks, James. So the Western Freeway at Parks Creek realigned the Ballarat-bound lanes and connectivity for about 10,000 vehicles that rely on that freeway daily. So reasonably heavily used piece of infrastructure. That project incorporated 540 tonnes of crushed glass in the structural asphalt, which is the sub-base layer, so the layer immediately preceding the wearing course. And that was used as a replacement for natural sand as part of the resurfacing of 2.4 kilometres of lanes. That quantity of sand, someone has calculated, is 2.5 million stubbies, which is about the number of stubbies being consumed in Melbourne over the next couple of weeks as pubs and clubs reopen. As a way of comparing it. And it's a pretty simple example of how recycled first principles are put into action and delivering a sustainable outcome. You know, in the past, it just wouldn't have been considered, it just would have been the natural sand and away we go. So, you know, it's simple, it's easy, and it's done and it's successful, which is great. Thanks, James. I want to talk about level crossing removal. So looking at a rail example and the level crossing removal program, you know, have been early adopters, I think, of using recycled crushed glass, and you know, are to be commended for the success they've achieved in taking this idea forward. Thanks. So at Williamstown North, new level crossing project in 2018, some new rail bridges built over Corette Creek Road. Used about 900 tonnes of glass sand material as bedding fill for combined service routes and for backfill for drainage piping, some of the applications that James spoke about earlier. Interestingly, and I think, you know, worth highlighting here, is that that product actually provided a significant cost saving to the project, around half the price of virgin sand, which is pretty significant. along with diverting a significant amount of material from landfill. And I think that's the perfect scenario where sustainable outcomes are achieved and cost benefits are also realised at the same time. So great success. And importantly, when we talk about this project, is that it's led to a uniform Metro Trains Melbourne spec for the application of glass sand, so it can be applied without requiring approval in future in these sorts of applications. And it's a great example of that intentional, deliberate approach to creating a BAU way of delivering transport infrastructure into the future. So it's a highly commendable and a great example of the success that we can have with these sorts of materials. And again, I take my hat off to that team at Level Crossing. So there are two examples. And if we just move on, thanks, James. We've reached the end of the delivery. Thanks, James, for your presentation, and I'll hand back now. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, James. We've got quite a few questions coming through, so we'll get started. Our first question is from Georgie, and they have asked, is a recycled first policy published and publicly available?
Yeah, so recycled first was announced by the recycled first policy was announced by the minister in March of this year. The reality is that it was an announcement and there were some words around it, but the actual scripting of a particular recycled first policy has taken some time. That has now occurred. It's gone through, and Ecologiq actually is where we actually wrote, if you like, the detailed policy and prepared it in conjunction with the Department of Transport. Department of Transport has now taken it through their process and approved it. So it is approved. Where is it publicly available? It'll be very close to being publicly available or being publicly available now. I can't be 100% sure, but Georgie, what I suggest is just drop me a line on that ecologiq@roadprojects.vic.gov.au email, and I will point you in the right direction.
Thanks, Tony. We've got a question from Shandan, and they have asked, what percentage of crushed glass with soil are reliable in road construction as sub-base material?
And again, that's very dependent on the end application or the class of aggregate that you're including it in. So I guess typically in a class 3 crushed rock, you can allow up to 15% recycled crushed glass. Again, as I mentioned before, we're undertaking quite a lot of work at the Australian Road Research Board to assess various blends of crushed rock with recycled content to benchmark its performance against virgin crushed rock, to therefore give the confidence that potentially we can increase these amounts. So again, if we were talking about a class 4 material, that potentially you could have up to 50% of recycled content, and if we were to consider class 2 material, obviously we reduce the amount of recycled content. But there's, I guess the percentages are fairly conservative at the moment, and therefore if we can demonstrate the performance, I think Vic Roads are happy to accept recycle or higher recycled contents in certain applications if we can demonstrate their fit for purpose performance before we apply them. I don't know whether Tony had any further comments on that.
All right, we'll move on to the next. We've got a question from Jess, and they have asked, how does the total GHG emission with use of RCG compared with the use of virgin materials?
It's a good question. And again, I guess very much it's going to be dependent on where you're using your recycled crushed glass or where you're getting it from. So I guess one of the most significant impacts on the LCA or GHG emissions is the transportation. And therefore you wouldn't want to be transporting your recycled crushed glass a long way away from its source. But typically, if you're incorporating a locally sourced recycled crushed glass, that it has the potential to reduce the emissions in comparison to the virgin aggregate. Also, we need to be bearing in mind by using or incorporating recycled crushed glass that we're reducing the amount of natural or virgin aggregates that we need to be mining for specific infrastructure projects. I guess the main thing is that it's very much on a case-by-case scenario, but probably the biggest contributing factor is the transportation emissions. And to actually produce the recycled crushed glass in a viable format is fairly similar in terms of its processing energies compared to the crushing of a natural aggregate.
Thanks, James. We've had a question come through from Roshananak, and they have asked, is there any traffic volume limit for roads paved with RCG?
I mean, again, it's going to depend on the type of paving, I guess, in terms of asphalt. If you incorporate recycled crushed glass into asphalt, again, you're going to be designing to a particular type of asphalt mix, and incorporating recycled crushed glass shouldn't be changing its properties, and therefore it's not going to affect the traffic limits that would be applied over that particular material. I guess it's maybe more of a concern in granular roads or so sealed granular roads, where you would consider the higher the traffic, the potentially the lower the amount of recycled crushed glass that you would allow in particular layers to make sure that it's meeting performance requirements. So again, in terms of there's the possibility to use recycled crushed glass in granular base materials, but at the moment that would be very much towards sort of likely traffic situations. But in terms of sort of more heavily trafficked applications, you would consider using your recycled crushed glass in the granular subbase instead. And again, obviously, the higher the traffic loading, the lower the allowable limit of recycled crushed glass to make sure you're meeting the correct classification of your granular subbase.
Thanks, James. We've got a question from Javad, and they have asked, while the sharp edges of crushed glass provide good interlock and shear strength in the asphalt, this can cause damage to the vehicle tyres, for instance. What measures are taken to eliminate the damage?
Well, in terms of the crushing of recycled crushed glass, because you're crushing it down to a 4.75 mil or below product for asphalt, there's not going to be any sharp edges that are going to be detrimental to vehicle tyres at that size fraction. So I think probably historically there were concerns over the incorporation of recycled crushed glass into asphalt when we were talking about much larger cullet sizes. but these days we're processing it to 4.75 mil and below, and therefore any edges wouldn't be any sharper or more detrimental to vehicle tyres than the natural aggregate that it would be replacing.
It's Tony here. I might just add to that. In early days of use of glass and asphalt, it was sometimes used and often used almost as a larger aggregate size, just to reinforce that aggregate size product, which could then, have some potential issues. It is crushed. We are talking about it as a sand here. It's also worth noting that the specification has much lower limits. In fact, sometimes zero limits on wearing course applications. And in fact, the industry is looking at whether they can be trialled to be increased rather than not used in wearing course applications. So the majority of the glass application is in sub-base layers, which don't get to the surface anyway.
Yeah. So as Tony says, in terms of the main trunk network in Victoria, currently we don't use recycled crushed glass in the wearing course, and recycled crushed glass in wearing course applications for asphalt is currently only used by local government, but again we're talking about potentially only 5% by total mass of mixture, so it's quite small amounts of recycled crushed glass in the mix. Although if you consider the amount of volume of wearing course that's laid each year, it still represents a fairly large tonnage of recycled crushed glass that could be used in that application.
This is probably a good point just to give a plug to the Ecologiq reference guides that you saw some snapshots of earlier in James's presentation. So the roads reference guide provides information on all the allowable limits for recycled products that are in specifications that are used in Victoria. And in the coming couple of weeks, there will be a release of a rail reference guide doing the same for rail, and an ancillary guide for if you like, roadside associated materials. So they'll be coming. Have a look. That you can get them on the Ecologiq Knowledge Share site, or you can contact us on the email address that I mentioned earlier, and it's in the presentation to get a copy of that, to get access to that.
Thanks, Tony. We've got a question from Tyler, and they have asked, how does the water absorption of crushed glass compare with natural sand?
My gut feeling is that it would absorb slightly less water than a natural sand, I guess down to probably the smoother surface texture of recycled crushed glass. So you would expect, say, the optimum moisture content of a 100% recycled crushed glass product to be a bit lower than that of a natural material. But I wouldn't expect this to significantly impact on construction issues, and obviously where we tend to be using it as a blended product, so potentially only 15% by total mass of the crushed rock, for example, in say a sub-base application. So I wouldn't expect it to have significant impacts.
Thanks, James. We've got a question from Andrew, and they have asked, are there any negatives to consider when using RCG within the granular layers of pavements?
I mean, again, it's all around, the maximum content that you would allow in there to make sure that your material is performing in terms of its resistance to permanent deformation. So in terms of allowable limits, at the moment, I think the allowable limits in Victoria are fairly conservative. And as I said, you could pretty much take a blend of crushed rock and recycled crushed glass and test it under the extra large wheel tracker, for example, so testing it under a moving wheel load to assess its permanent deformation performance, and generally it's shown to perform fairly well, even at potentially up to say 40% recycled crushed glass. But each time you'd have to be doing that on a case-by-case basis. It would be dependent on the natural crushed rock as well. So there's opportunities to potentially increase the amount of recycled crushed glass in some of these sub-base applications. You just need to be mindful of performance on a case-by-case basis. Again, I guess the other concern that you might have is if you're introducing large amounts of unclean recycled crushed glass, that there's the potential for some leachates to get into the underlying soil. But again, there's testing that can be undertaken to ensure that these leachates aren't of major concern. But one thing that has been noted is generally you want to be including it in sealed pavement as opposed to an unsealed pavement. That once you allow water to get into a granular pavement, that any leachate issues are likely to be exasperated in that sense. But again, it's all down to management. So there's ways to assess the potential for leachates. There's also the options for cleaning your glass to reduce those types of issues as well.
Thanks, James. We've got a question from Hoysen, and they have asked, are you aware of any anti-stripping agent that can be used in conjunction with the recycled glass to improve glass bitumen adhesion, improvement asphalt moisture sensitivity, like the role that hydrated lime plays in improving adhesion between natural aggregate and bitumen?
Yeah, again, obviously there's a number of, I guess, proprietary anti-stripping agents that exist. You probably end up having to assess them again on a case-by-case scenario to assess what works best for a particular asphalt mixture type, and also bearing in mind the natural aggregate that you're using in your asphalt mixture that's still going to be the much larger component of the asphalt mix in comparison to the recycled crushed glass. Again, there's the potential that hydrated lime will also improve the stripping resistance. Recycled crushed glass, I guess, is likely to be slightly acidic in nature, and therefore the incorporation of hydrated lime should have a similar effect as it would do if you were including it in, say, an asphalt generated from a granite mixture.
Perfect, thanks, James. We probably have time for one more question, and this has come from Ross. And they have asked, how effective is the washing process on the mobile plant, or is washing only available through the larger fixed plants?
I think generally the mobile plants wouldn't include washing. They would purely just be for crushing, but I'm sure there is the option to have some kind of washing facility associated with it. And obviously one of the issues with processing and washing is cost, and the more processing on or adding on washing as well, the more cost you're adding, and therefore you just need to be mindful of whether you're going to require the washing for the end application of your choice. Obviously, if you're going to be incorporating your recycled crushed glass into concrete, then the washing is important. But some of the other applications, it's not necessary to wash the glass, and the performance can be managed.
Perfect, thanks, James. That's probably all we have time for now in regards to questions. So I just wanted to thank our presenters today and thank you to our audience for tuning in. We hope to see you all at our next webinar, Crumb Rubbing Masterclass, on the 4th of November at 12 p.m. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabella. And thank you, Tony.
No, thank you, Joe.